Hi everyone, my name is Erik Adler, and today I'd like to talk about this book, Brothers and Friends, The Diaries of Major Warren Hamilton Lewis, an intimate portrait of C.S. Lewis, as seen through the eyes of his beloved brother. The book is fairly broken, but I enjoyed reading this one. It was very interesting. It's an intimate portrait of a man during half a century of the first half of the 20th century, basically, and it is a time that I really love. I love the time around the two world wars and the time between the two world wars. It was a very interesting part of European history and of American history as well. So I really enjoyed reading this book, and it shed also new light on C.S. Lewis and on other people surrounding C.S. Lewis, for example, J.R.R. Tolkien. We will come to that. So, the book offers an interesting picture of British upper middle class life in the first half of the 20th century. Warren Lewis, brother of the more famous C.S. Lewis, although being an army officer, advancing to the rank of major, always preferred a solitary life of books, walks, and good conversation with a few friends. On August 4th, 1919, during a holiday spent in their father's house in Northern Ireland, close to Dublin, he writes of himself and his brother, called Jack. We read, smoke, argue, walk, talk nonsense, and play the gramophone in the garden when it is fine. It is in times like these that one envies the rich. If we only had enough money to shut ourselves off from the world and live our own lotus life. Years later, after tea with a family, with which he was acquainted from his Shanghai days, Warren takes a walk. Oh, the glorious relief of being out in the wind and sun, and alone again. It was almost worth the tea party, he exclaims. And in May 1930, I learned from this, which is the poem The Excursion by William Wordsworth from 1814, that I can no longer be reproached with having no philosophy, ergo a bad philosophy. I am an Epicurean. In the Wordsworth poem, there is talk of preferring tranquility to all things. Such a person, Wordsworth says, does by system rank as the prime object of a wise man's aim, security from shock of accident, release from fear, and cherished peaceful days for their own sakes as mortal life's chief good. Warren remained a lifelong bachelor, and there is no mention of him ever dating a woman. Early in 1930, he sails home from China, visiting Japan and the US on the way. He writes, "Now that I begin to take stock of my surroundings, I find to my horror that out of a total of 11 passengers, 6 are women." He is now 34 years old. A month later he writes, "I sat on deck for a little after supper, but Mrs. Laache came on deck looking somewhat amorous. So Barton and I fled to the main deck." After having returned to England, he and Jack are invited to friends, and Warren writes, "I was just getting comfortable when he, their host, uttered the fatal 'Shall we join the ladies?' which put me out the more as I had not been expecting it." Much later, in July 1946, Warren is now 51 years old. He is again invited to the same friends, and he accepts very reluctantly, for with all my army experience, I am still as shy of women as a hobbledehoy, he writes. He seems to have had a very relaxed and friendly relationship to Maureen, Mrs. Moore's daughter, all of his life. They frequently go bathing in the lake together, so for example in September 1933. He's 38, she's 28. It is astonishing that there never seems to be any sexual tension at all between them. Maureen is described as being intelligent and unselfish, quite different from her mother. Throughout the diaries, there is constant mention of Minto, which is what Jack and Warren called Mrs. Moore, Jack's presumed lover and surrogate mother for 30 years. She was 26 years older than he was. At the beginning of the book there is an editorial note. It should also be noted that certain passages in this manuscript were deleted at the request of and as a courtesy to the C.S. Lewis estate, it says. Most of the omissions have been done in passages where Warren writes about Mrs. Moore. Warren mentions Mrs. Moore's good looks in July 1930. At that time she is already 58 years old, Jack is 32. And she and Jack had been in a relationship probably for 11 years. In December 1933, Warren says about Mrs. Moore that what he had thought was typical of his father was, and I quote, a basic element in the upper middle class character of the latter half of the last century. Both his father and Mrs. Moore, and he writes, regarded good manners as a form of behavior which one adopts in dealing with those with whom one is not intimate. He regrets that Jack's whole life is subordinated to that of Mrs. Moore, financially, socially, recreationally. But he notes that she is very fond of Jack, and that she looks after him meticulously. When Warren tries to utter very guarded criticism, as he calls it, of Mrs. Moore, it sends Jack stumping away in a temper. August 1934. Warren is by now a fixed member of the household, and he writes, I can say with no reservations whatsoever that the past 12 months has been incomparably the happiest of my life. He has resigned from the army and is devoting his time to writing the history of the Lewis family. In later years, Warren's criticism of Mrs. Moore becomes harsher. For him, love is an ideal to work towards, whereas her ideal seems to be hate. After her death in 1951, he says, it's fascinating to muse on what his, that is Jack's, life might have been if he had never had the crushing misfortune to meet her. If Mrs. Moore served as Jack's surrogate mother, Jack served as Warren's surrogate wife. As early as 1922, Warren speaks of the depression which I have never outgrown at parting from J, which is Jack, C.S. Lewis. And in August 1931, I never feel so completely at my best as when setting out on a trip with J. From August 1934 onwards, Warren often mentions his fear that Jack might die before he does. It sounds like the fear of an elderly man to lose his wife. In 1943, Warren starts to serve as a full-time secretary to Jack, typing circa 12,000 letters for him in 20 years, reading Jack's mail and answering it, which of course brings them even closer together. There is some discussion of religion in the diaries, including Warren's skepticism concerning Roman Catholicism. In May 1931, he starts praying again. This, quote, was no sudden impulse but the result of a conviction of the truth of Christianity, which has been growing on me for a considerable time. Warren describes his development as, quote, indifference, skepticism, atheism, agnosticism, and back to Christianity. In January 1932, he receives a letter from Jack telling him that Jack too has started to go to communion. And Warren writes, had he not done so, I, with my altered views, would have found hardly a bar between us, but a lack of a complete identity of interest, which I should have regretted. They thus seem to have found their way back to Christianity at about the same time. In April 1946, Warren talks of quote, that restless melancholy, discontent, which the spring weather always produces in me. For years I thought I was a materialist, it was a materialist phenomenon, that the discontent would be instantly cured by a change of station, more money, more leave, etc. But I begin to suspect that it is spiritual, a subconscious longing for another world. In September 1933 he writes that old age must be a terrible thing to an atheist, meaning Mrs. Moore. Quote, bad enough for the atheist of intellect and noble character, presumably her daughter Maureen. But there must be times when for a selfish and stupid old woman it must be sheer hell. In all its harshness it says quite a lot about what religion meant to Warren. There's very little talk of politics in the diaries. In a discussion with Jack in August 1931, Warren defends, quote, a benevolent despotism, and he calls the British government of India, quote, the best autocracy the world has ever seen, although admitting that it, quote, does not appear to be an unqualified success. Jack criticizes him for hating the Irish, a claim that Warren does not object to. In August 1933 he writes, I found that by an odd coincidence Jay and I have had the same dream of how to utilize the enormous wealth, qualify as a solicitor and fight the battles of all the victims of capitalist tyranny to the House of Lords if necessary. These are two immature intellectuals whose human contacts consisted almost solely in other immature intellectuals. The childishness is apparent. On Saturday 19th of August 1922, Warren, Jack and two female friends of Mrs. Moore's play hide and seek in the garden after supper. Warren is 27, Jack is 24. In early September 1933, the brothers go to see King Kong at the cinema, and Warren writes excitedly about it in his diary. In August 1948, they go together to see Walt Disney's Bambi. Jack is now 50, Warren is 53. In September 1933, Warren sees a British fascist for the first time. Quote, he looked so like one of the more cowardly sort of criminal that I supposed he must have been an honest man, in spite of his mean and untrustworthy appearance. Later in November 1934, he hears from a friend and former student of Jack, who has been to Germany, that 40 persons have died from torture and 150 of natural causes in a concentration camp near Munich since the camp opened. People, quote, are constantly being arrested and vanishing. He, and that's the guest, doubts if Hitler is fully aware of the cruelties which are being practiced in his name. This was probably a common misconception at the time. There's not much about Warren's alcoholism in the diaries. In August 1949, he thinks he will learn to use alcohol instead of abusing it. At the end of his life, however, he became a teetotaler. These 335 pages are excerpts of about 1,000,000 words, and one would have liked more about the relationship between Jack and Mrs. Moore, and especially about their first years together. But Warren writes that he didn't know how and when the relationship started, and that he never asked Jack about it, which is unfortunate. I had also expected more on the Inklings and on the brothers' most famous friend, J.R. Tolkien, whom they called Tollers. Tolkien too was in a difficult marriage, and Warren seems to have regarded it as even more unfortunate than Jack's relationship to Mrs. Moore, which may be a slight exaggeration. When Jack went to visit Tolkien after Tolkien had broken a ligament in his leg while playing squash, he found Madame there. Quote, so could not have much conversation with him. And, of all the men I have met, poor Tolkien is the most unfortunate. That is, more unfortunate than Jack. Edith Tolkien was not at all intellectual, and she was known for her authoritarianism. Jack's death in November 1963 was the most devastating experience in Warren's life. In 1967, true to his Epicureanism, he writes that, quote, "The great pleasures of my life have been Jay's society, books and scenery, in that order." If Jack had been unhealthily attached to Mrs. Moore, Warren had been as unhealthily attached to his brother. These were my thoughts on the book Brothers and Friends, The Diaries of Warren Hamilton Lewis. I enjoyed reading this very much. I would have liked a bigger excerpt, perhaps a few volumes. I think I would have read them all, because I really like the times, and I read at the moment the Chronicles of Narnia also, the 7 books I have read and reviewed, the first 3 here on my channel. I'm currently reading the 4th, Prince Caspian, and it was nice to read this diary of C.S. Lewis's brother parallel to these books. I really enjoyed this, and I can recommend you reading this if you're interested in an eyewitness to the first half of the 20th century. And next time I hope to discuss Prince Caspian, the 4th volume in the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. I wish you a good time. Please feel free to comment on this video if you liked it, what you didn't like, below. Feel free to subscribe, of course, to this channel, to give me a thumbs up if you like this video, and I'll talk to you soon again, I hope.